By the time Michael left for the park, the tornado had already struck and moved on. The rain that followed lasted for only 15 minutes, and then it was all over. The public park next to the library was where most of the kids from Briarwood Regional hung out during the summer months. Joe was already there when Michael arrived. He found him sitting on an empty pizza box beneath a gnarled old sycamore several yards from where most of the other kids were gathered. Joe held out a half empty can of beer in greeting. Michael shook his head and stared down at the wet grass in front of him. Joe pulled the box from beneath him, tore off the top, and handed it to his friend. Found this over there, he said, pointing to a nearby trash can. Then he sat back on the half of the box that remained. Michael lowered himself onto the cardboard. He had spent the past few weeks avoiding Joe, and yet, when he had nowhere else to turn, this was the person he called. He realized now that by making up the theft story, he had dragged Joe even further into the dark mire that threatened to swallow them both up. "What did you do with it?" Joe asked. The red bandana he had rolled up and tied around his head was dark with sweat. Michael didn't have to ask what he meant. "Hid it where nobody's ever going to find it." "Where?" The mosquitoes were biting furiously. Michael wished he had sprayed himself with insect repellent before he'd left the house. He shook his head. "It's better if you don't know." "How come the cops showed up at your house?" "They're checking out everyone within a 4-block radius." He slapped hard at a mosquito. The smack left a red imprint of his fingers on his arm. "The ballistics experts narrowed it down to our neighborhood." Joe took a swallow of beer and stared down at the can thoughtfully. "They'll be coming to my house too then." When Michael didn't answer, he added, "We've got to get this stolen gun story straight." Michael tugged at the wet grass with his hand, pulling thin blades loose from the soil. "You don't have to do this, you know." Joe put his hand on Michael's shoulder and leaned into his face. "So, what you're saying is, when the cops come to my house, it's okay to tell them you made up that whole stolen gun thing so they wouldn't find out you're the one who fired the shot?" Michael stared down at Joe's hand. He felt the weight of it. "Yeah," he said. "Go ahead. Tell them that." And he meant it. Joe smacked him lightly on the side of the head. "I was yanking your chain, you moron. Lighten up." Michael felt the full impact of that playful slap. Not the physical pain of it. There was none. What he felt was the desperation behind it. The desperation to keep things the way they had always been between them. And to that end, he was sure, Joe would stand by him, tell the lies Michael asked him to tell, risk whatever lay ahead for both of them. A risk, Michael knew, his friend did not have to take, and he could not help wondering, in that moment, if he would have been willing to do the same for Joe. "Hey, man, no matter what, you're pretty much home free," Joe said. "They can't prove anything without the weapon. If they've got any evidence at all, it's circumstantial." Michael stared up at the old sycamore behind Joe. The base was almost 4 feet in diameter and had 3 trunks growing from it. It reminded him of the ghost tree, but it wasn't as big. He hadn't thought about that place in years, although he and Joe used to hang out there as kids and tell each other horror stories about the great swamp devil. He thought of that now, sitting across from Joe. The difference was that the horror story they shared this time was real. "Well?" Joe was studying him closely. "Well, what?" "Well, what do you want me to tell the cops?" He took another long gulp of beer. Michael shrugged. "Same thing I did. That you borrowed the gun a few days ago, and last night somebody broke into your car and stole it. Along with my CD player," Joe added. "No problem." Joe's eyes were unusually bright. His face flushed. Michael had the sudden disconcerting thought that his friend was actually enjoying all this. The dampness was seeping through the cardboard. Michael stood up, remembering suddenly that Joe had lost his job. "How'd you manage to get fired?" he asked. Joe chugged the rest of his beer and held up the can. "I was having a little refreshment in the men's room on my break." "They caught you drinking on the job?" Michael shook his head. "No, man. They caught me drinking on my break." Michael picked up the soggy cardboard and glanced over at the trash can. His preoccupation kept him from having to look at the snide grin on Joe's face. "So what are you going to do now?" He began to fold the cardboard into a smaller square. Joe shrugged. "We've still got a few weeks left before school starts," he said. "Might as well enjoy them." Michael had taken only a few steps toward the trash can when he spotted the police car drive when he spotted the police car by the drive-up book drop in front of the library. Doug Bull, now in his regular uniform, was crossing the park to where a group of kids sat in a tight circle playing cards by flashlight. Joe had seen him too. He crushed the beer can with his foot and kicked it into the bushes. "I'll call you later," he told Michael, heading toward the sidewalk. Then he cocked his head in the direction of Doug Bull. "Well, move it, man. You just gonna stand there?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Haven't you seen enough of the hangman for one night?"